Okay, good evening. At least it's evening here for us. I'm Jen Epstein with the National Park Service, the National Mall and Memorial Parks, and we are really excited to be offering this series of teacher programs in honor of the upcoming anniversary of the Lincoln Memorial in May. And so we're really hoping to generate some excitement and get you teachers thinking about different ways that you can maybe use the story of the Lincoln Memorial and some of the side stories. We have so many different stories about President Lincoln that we have invited some friends to help us tell these stories. Before we get to our main presentation tonight, I'd like to introduce Edward from the Trust for the National Mall. The Trust is our venue for this series, and Edward will tell you just a bit about his organization.
Thank you so much, Jen. So I'm Edward. I'm with the Trust for the National Mall. We're the philanthropic partner of the National Park Service on the National Mall. And we're really delighted to host this education series leading up to the commemoration of the Lincoln Memorial's 100-year anniversary. The legacy of President Lincoln and the memorial is large, open, and ongoing. There's just so much to talk about and so much to discuss and learn. And so we're really, really thrilled to partner with the Park Service on the mall every single day, and here as well, and with the Ford's Theater too, to lead this conversation. It's part 2 of 6, so there's just so much to come. So thanks so much for joining us, and back to you, Jen.
Thank you, Edward. Yes, we're very excited to be sharing all of our resources here together. I'm joined by my colleague, Bethany Bajent from the Park Service, and we are really happy to have with us tonight Alex Wood from Ford's Theater. Ford's Theater is one of our closest partners. We do an awful lot of education work and other aspects of our parks and our sites, coordinate a lot of different activities and things together. But Alex and I spend a lot of time, especially during this pandemic, we have spent a lot of time offering joint virtual programs together. And so I'm really excited to have her participate with us tonight. And she has got a fascinating story, another way of looking at how we memorialize President Lincoln. So feel free to throw comments and questions in the chat. I'll keep an eye on that, but I think you'll find this a really fascinating story, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas about how you could use this as one of the stories we share in your classes. So I will turn it over now to Alex. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be connecting with all of you. So I am Alex Wood. I work at Ford's Theater Society, and we are the nonprofit partner of the National Park Service Ford's Theater. And so today we're going to be talking about Ford's as a place of memory and sort of how Ford's has become the place that we recognize today, and how it is this living memorial to President Lincoln through sort of many different facets. So before we can get to Ford's as a memorial, I will just go through quickly the reason why Ford's is even still standing. So Civil War, Washington, we have this map to sort of get oriented here. The city itself is quite compact. Ford's Theater is right in the heart of downtown Washington, D.C. So we're about 6 blocks from the White House and about 10 blocks from the US Capitol. So those 2 landmarks are noted on our map here. So Ford's Theater is right in the center there. And this is what downtown looked like back in Lincoln's day. So notice the rough, unpaved roads. Notice the hospital here along the National Mall, the canal that ran through the heart of Washington City. Very different landscape for President Lincoln than what we think of in our nation's capital today. Also notice, just because we're talking about the Lincoln at 100, out here is the Potomac River, and that's where our Lincoln Memorial would be today if we were taking this photograph. So very different landscape for President Lincoln. So thinking about the landscape, but zooming in to talk about the people and the places here in Washington, I just wanted to share these 2 pictures. Sometimes we look at historic images and there aren't a lot of people in them. And so here we have two photographs. The upper left photograph is taken at Freedman's Village, which is in Arlington, just across the river from where the Lincoln Memorial is today. And that was one of the contraband camps, the sort of refugee camps for freedom seekers who had come to Washington to start new lives in freedom. And then in the lower right here, we have a photograph of people standing outside the U.S. Christian Commission, which was also downtown Washington. And just looking at these photographs, we get a real cross-section of people who were living and moving around Washington, D.C. at the same time that President Lincoln was. So looking at the photo in the lower right, we can see soldiers, wounded soldiers, missing limbs. There are women, there are children. When I show this picture to students, a lot of them notice first thing that every single person is wearing a hat. So important fashion tidbit of the 1860s, right? We almost never see anyone outside without their hat on. So the course of the Civil War, 4 years of the Civil War, the population of Washington tripled. And of course, this was the world that President Lincoln was moving and living in while he was president here in Washington, D.C. Okay, so end of the war, April 1865. On April 9th, Lee surrendered his army to General Grant. And with this surrender, it signaled Union victory, it signaled the end of the war, and very importantly, it signaled the end of the threat to Washington City. So all of those people moving through town, the freedom seekers and refugees, the soldiers, the veterans, everybody moving through town, for 4 years, they'd been right on the edge of kind of imminent danger, right? And so finally in April of 1865, that threat is relieved. And so the people in Washington started to party, and people in Washington in 1865 party very much like we do today. So they set off fireworks, they lit bonfires, they illuminated the city in this grand illumination, the celebration last night. They paraded through the streets and sang songs, and a group of people went up to the White House and called out for President Lincoln to make a speech. And he came to the window on the evening of April 11th, and he delivered a speech in which he talked really specifically about sort of ideas and plans for Reconstruction. So amidst the celebration, President Lincoln is already thinking really practically and logistically about what's going to happen next. And in this speech, he comes out in public support of giving the right to vote to some African-American men, including those who had fought in the United States colored troops and helped save the Union. And this was really big. It was radical to hear President Lincoln come out in public support of suffrage and citizenship for African-American men. And there was one person in the crowd that night who didn't like what he heard. That man was John Wilkes Booth. John Booth, famous actor, known Confederate sympathizer, sort of ardent racist and white supremacist. He believed in the Confederate cause. He believed in the system of slavery, and he did not want African-American men to become citizens of this nation. And so he'd sort of spent the war sort of tooling around, trying to find ways to support the Confederate cause without actually joining the Confederate Army. But here he was in Washington listening to President Lincoln talk about voting rights and citizenship for African-American men. And he turned to the guy next to him and he said, "By God, I'll put him through. That's the last speech he'll ever give." So in this moment on April 11th, we think John Wilkes Booth wanted to kill President Lincoln, but he didn't have the opportunity, and he would get that opportunity just 3 days later at Ford's Theater. So on April 14th, 1865, President Lincoln and Mrs. Lincoln and two guests let Ford's Theater know that they wanted to see the play that night. The play that night was called Our American Cousin. It was a comedy. It was going to be the 1000th performance of this show, so everybody knew it really well, and including John Wilkes Booth. And he happened to be at Ford's Theater that morning picking up his mail. And while he was there, he learned the news that the president and Mrs. Lincoln were going to be at the theater that night, and this was his opportunity. So he set off and gathered around him a group of people who would support his plan, not just to assassinate President Lincoln, but to also assassinate the vice president and the Secretary of State. So here we have them here. Here's Vice President Andrew Johnson, Secretary of State William Seward. So John Wilkes Booth's plan was bigger than just killing President Lincoln. He wanted to decapitate the Union government, send it into chaos, give the Confederate Army a chance to sort of get its act together and keep fighting. So he gathered around him this group of conspirators, and these were people that he had met previously in the war. They'd been connected by Confederate spies, possibly John Surratt, Mary Surratt's son. And these were people who John Wilkes Booth had met when he'd been talking about trying to kidnap President Lincoln. And so the kidnapping plot had never come to fruition. It had completely fallen apart. But here John Wilkes Booth is with this plan to assassinate the president, and he has people to turn to. So he assigns the other two attacks that night to two of these conspirators. George Atzerodt is assigned to assassinate the vice president, and Lewis Powell is assigned to assassinate the Secretary of State. I will say that both of those attacks failed. George Atzerodt never attacked the vice president. He got drunk and ran away instead. Lewis Powell did attack the Secretary of State in his home, injuring him pretty badly, but the Secretary of State survived. So really significant that 2/3 of John Wilkes Booth's plan failed. All right, so at Ford's Theater, John Wilkes Booth hatches the whole plan to coincide with the single moment in the show where he will sneak in. He doesn't, no, not even sneak. He walks straight into the presidential box. He's not in disguise. He's not hiding. He hands a calling card to a messenger. He walks into the presidential box, and as the funniest line is delivered on stage in the show and the audience is roaring with laughter, he shoots President Lincoln in the back of the head. The laughter muffles the sound of the gunshot. Very few people hear anything. If they hear a pop or a bang, they think something has fallen over backstage. Major Rathbone, one of the Lincoln's guests, jumps up and tries to stop John Wilkes Booth. After John Wilkes Booth has shot the single shot out of his pistol, he throws the gun aside and he stabs at Major Rathbone. Major Rathbone gets sliced pretty badly in the arm, but he's still trying to stop John Wilkes Booth. As John Wilkes Booth jumps out of the box, lands hard on the stage, he yells at the audience, "Sic semper tyrannis," and then he runs out the back door, gallops off on his horse into the night. John Wilkes Booth is captured 12 days later. He's killed as they are attempting to arrest him, and he's refusing to surrender. So John Wilkes Booth doesn't get away with it. And the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth is a very exciting story. But meanwhile, back at Ford's Theater that night, it's chaos. This unprecedented tragedy has just taken place in front of an audience of almost 2,000 people. Oh, this is a floor plan of the theater. This actually was used as evidence in the trial of the assassination conspirators. So here we have the presidential box above the stage, and this is John Wilkes Booth's escape out the back door and out through the alley on horseback. Okay. So while John Wilkes Booth initially gets away, it's chaos in the theater. Everyone had been laughing. All of a sudden, John Wilkes Booth runs across the stage. People recognize him immediately. Remember, he's not in disguise. He's not in costume. He's a famous actor. But a lot of people thought that perhaps this was part of the show. And so this confusion melts away as people in the box start screaming and hollering that something horrible has happened. And so doctors happen to get into the box. They realize that President Lincoln has been fatally shot, and they make the decision to carry him out of the theater. And they don't think he'll survive on those bumpy dirt roads in a carriage ride back to the White House, even though it's only 6 blocks away. And so they just start knocking on doors, and they end up taking him into the Peterson boarding house, which is directly across the street from Ford's Theater. So it wasn't a hospital. It wasn't a friend's house. It was just a random boarding house that was in the right place at the right time. This painting by Carl Bursch depicts that moment where they're carrying President Lincoln out of the theater. We see him sort of haloed by a pillow here. And they're pounding on doors sort of behind the painter's view and figuring out where they're going to take him. And I think that this painting does a really good job of evoking the emotion of that night. In this painting, I see a lot of fear and chaos and confusion and concern. Notice the spectators up in the window peeking their head out to see what's happening on the street. And then this person pointing the way toward the Peterson boarding house. It's hard to tell, but I think he might be in some kind of uniform. There seem to be a fair number of brass buttons on his jacket. Okay. So they carry President Lincoln straight back into the back bedroom of the Peterson boarding house, which is this picture. They put him in bed. They do their best to make him comfortable. And President Lincoln dies the next morning at 7:22 a.m. So 10th Street, which had been a place of joy and celebration and recreation and entertainment, with the theater across the street and boarding houses bustling on either side and all around, becomes this place of tragedy. And it's kind of interesting too, because we have Ford's Theater where President Lincoln was assassinated, where he was shot. And then we have the Peterson boarding house where President Lincoln died. So there's two sort of components to the story and two components to the tragedy. This room belonged to a man named Willie Clark. And immediately in the aftermath of the assassination, people started coming to 10th Street to sort of mark this historic place and to take a souvenir from this historic place. So Willie Clark arrives home on Saturday morning after partying all night long, right? He's out celebrating the end of the war, just like everyone else had been. And he comes home to find his room in disarray, and he learns that President Lincoln had died in his bed. So a couple days later, he writes this letter to his sister, and that's the script we have on the right side of the screen. And he describes how, his life is turned upside down. He describes how hundreds of people a day are coming to see his room, how they want to see the bed where President Lincoln died, and how he has to watch them because they might steal his stuff, and how he's, they're taking bits of wallpaper and chips off of his dresser and his belongings, all as mementos, physical souvenirs from this place of tragedy. Interestingly, Willie Clark himself has some souvenirs from this moment. He also describes in this letter how he has Lincoln's clothes, his jacket and his boots that the doctors had removed when they'd put him in bed. But Willie Clark doesn't decide to keep these. He decides to return them to Robert Lincoln, the Lincoln's oldest son, because he thinks that that's the right thing to do. So already in these moments after the tragedy occurs, we see people, everyday people, making choices about how to mark and remember this moment. One last thing that Willie Clark does not return to the Lincoln family. He has a piece of lace that had fallen off of Mrs. Lincoln's outfit. She had followed her husband's body into the Peterson house, spent the night weeping in the front parlor as the doctors sort of kept her away from the deathbed. And Willie Clark says he sends this piece of lace to his sister, and he says, "You should keep it because it's historically important." So sort of interesting to think about how we start making choices about how to save, remember, and preserve this history as it's happening. Ford's Theater went from a place of joy and entertainment to a site of tragedy. We see it covered and draped in black mourning cloth in this picture. Notice the guards guarding the crime scene within. And inside, Matthew Brady was hired to take photographs to document the crime scene. And the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth was happening, and John Wilkes Booth was killed and captured, all while this is going on. Inside Ford's Theater, many of the actors were arrested. John T. Ford, proprietor, was arrested. How could he not know that this was about to happen in his place? But he was deemed, not involved in the conspiracy at all. And so ultimately he was given the theater back. And so this photograph, we're not sure if this photograph was taken the day after the assassination or if it was taken in July of that year, when Ford was given back his theater and he tried to open again as a place of entertainment. So what we see here, we see those horrible dirt roads. We see Ford's Theater still draped in black. And here this sandwich board is advertising a play. It was a very racist play called The Octoroon. And The Octoroon was the show that was scheduled to play on April 15th, 1865. It did not play on April 15th, but in July of that year, just a few days after the Lincoln assassination conspirators had been tried and executed, actually, John T. Ford tried to open Octoroon on stage at Ford's Theater, and people wouldn't have it. He received threats against the building. Some people said, if you dare put another play on this stage, we're going to burn the building to the ground. And so in light of this, he couldn't just return to business as usual. People were not ready to come back to Ford's Theater and see it as a place of joy and laughter and entertainment. It was still marked by this tragedy, just too much. And actually, speaking with students from all over the country, there's sort of similar places of entertainment that have been marred by violence, right? We think about perhaps the movie theater in Aurora, where that mass shooting happened several years ago, right? People weren't ready to go to the movies right after that happened. There was the Bataclan concert in France, right? And again, there's these places of joy and festivity that then are just changed forever by a tragedy that happens. So Ford's Theater could not be a theater right away. But we are again today. I don't know if any of you have been to Ford's Theater, if you've visited us recently, but today we are a working theater. And so how did we get from a place that the public was willing to destroy, burn to the ground, to a place today where we get thousands and thousands and thousands of visitors a year who want to see plays on stage, who want to see the theater, who want to learn the story of Lincoln's assassination, right? So that's quite a journey. All right. Getting ourselves resituated in modern Washington. Here's Ford's Theater, right in the heart of downtown. As I pointed out on the historic map, we have the White House just about 6 blocks away, the United States Capitol just about 10 blocks away. And of course, now today, our modern National Mall, there's the Lincoln Memorial, not too far. Thinking again of our sort of memorial landscape and how Ford is sort of nestled within it. This photograph from the 1930s shows us Lincoln Park on Capitol Hill, the Capitol building, the Washington Monument way off in the distance there, the Lincoln Memorial way off in the distance there. So Ford's Theater is tucked in this neighborhood up here. Actually, is that I think that might be the old post office tower. So Ford's Theater is in here somewhere. All right. So how did we get from 1865 burning the building down to 2021 live, vibrant place of art and museum and historic site worthy of your field trips? All right. So let's have a vote. Go ahead and throw in the chat. It's 1865. What would you do with a place like Ford's Theater? Would you tear it down? Be in that crowd that wanted to destroy it? Keep it as a theater? We already have a little bit of a spoiler alert that didn't happen right away. Would you turn it into an office building? make it an educational institute devoted to Lincoln. B gets a vote, educational institution. Anyone else? Another vote for D. 1A, tear it down, yeah. We can certainly relate to that, right? Other sites of tragedy have been torn down almost immediately. Okay. What's fascinating is that all four of these options were sort of on the table in 1865, just as they are today. Oh, interesting. Yeah, thank you, Susan. So initially, there was a plan to make it an educational institution, and the YMCA was actually going to purchase the building from John Ford and turn it into this educational institution. That didn't happen. They didn't get their money together. And so that's when John T. Ford tried to open another play. That's when he got the threats to burn the building to the ground. And so he couldn't keep it as a theater. He didn't want it to get burned down. And so Secretary of War Edwin Stanton actually hatched this plan to purchase the building from John T. Ford and turn it into an office building. And it's sort of interesting how he made the argument that an office building would be an appropriate memorial to President Lincoln. So in December of 1865, he wrote this letter to Congress, and he published it in the newspaper, and he's describing his reason for purchasing the building that is Ford's Theater and turning it into an office building. So he says, you know, the public feeling regards that spot as hallowed by the blood of their martyr president, and considered that its desecration as a place of theatrical exhibition would be a national reproach and outrage against humanity. So that's some pretty strong language there. So cannot go back to being a theater. But then he says there would seem to be no more fitting purpose to which the building could be applied than to have the spot hallowed by his blood consecrated to the preservation of the memorials of those who, like himself, suffered as martyrs in the national cause. So who would those be? Those would be soldiers and veterans. And so he says that turning Ford's Theater into an office facility that houses the records of soldiers who Lincoln cared for so much, that would be an appropriate use of this space. And it would be a way to honor President Lincoln's martyrdom in this place. Also kind of interesting to think about the amount of religious imagery that's used in these letters, talking about Lincoln as a martyr, talking about the place being hallowed and sacred and consecrated. So really intense sentiments about this place. So we also see the power of place manifesting already in this moment. Stanton was an interesting player. Didn't they find the only photo of Lincoln in his coffin in his files years later? Oh, you know, I don't know. I know that there is one photograph of Lincoln in his open coffin from his funeral procession. Yeah. So somebody snuck in and took a photo. But was it, I don't know if it was found in Stanton's files. Was it found in Stanton's files?
That I'm not sure about. Yeah, I don't know.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Interesting player is a good phrase though, isn't it?
Yeah. So Stanton gets his way and they gut the interior of Ford's Theater. So the exterior bricks are pretty much the same, but inside is completely changed and they turn it into an office building. So here we have our 1800s office workers. I'm always amused. I think, you know, if you look at this open floor plan where they're all sitting at desks, it looks an awful lot like contemporary office spaces. So But here we have the office workers working at their desks. And so Ford's Theater became the place where pension applications were processed. So they wouldn't necessarily be approved here, but the medical records and the service records of Union soldiers were kept in Ford's Theater. And then as veterans applied for pensions and benefits, these clerks would search through the records and, verify their claims. So Ford's Theater was this sort of functional memorial to President Lincoln in this way. And again, the power of place wasn't lost on anybody. So while the workers were working away within the walls of Ford's Theater, the people in the neighborhood knew full well what had happened in that place. So even though it wasn't a theater, even though there was no sign on the outside saying what had happened there, people in the neighborhood knew that that was where President Lincoln had been assassinated. And this is an excerpt from one of my favorite books, They Knew Lincoln by John E. Washington. This is John E. Washington himself up here. Yeah, Susan, Clara Barton's office is just a couple blocks away, where she was also helping to find missing soldiers, right? So you can see how that was the sort of thriving life of downtown Washington. So Johnny Washington grew up just down the street from Ford's Theater in the block that today has the FBI building. And he describes being terrified of Ford's Theater. Now, my disclaimer is I have never seen any ghosts here, and I've been here for a lot of years, and I've been here late at night after shows and early in the morning for special projects, and I've never seen any ghosts, but Mr. Washington was sure that there would be some. And so he describes as a child, and I just absolutely love this excerpt, it's so vivid, but he describes, we children of the neighborhood looked upon it with awe. And I can remember the first time I became lost on my way home. I began to cry from fear. And as the lights came on, I could think of but one thing, and that was of passing the old Ford's Theater where Lincoln was shot. Though weary and worn, when I turned into 10th at F Street, I began to trot. And as I approached the building, I ran faster and faster with my eyes fixed straight ahead. I imagined everything could happen and began to feel the hot and cold chills from ghosts that were coming out of the building, for were not nearly all of the crowd who saw the murder dead. So he's not scared of the building being haunted by Lincoln even. He's scared of the building being haunted by everyone who was there that night. So he made it home safely. And then as an adult, he wrote this book, and he collected all of these stories from his family and his grandmother's friends who remembered being in Washington when Lincoln was alive, from meeting Lincoln at different points during his career. Definitely recommend this book. But again, just super impressed by this power of place. So even though the building was functioning as something completely different, everybody knew what was happening here. So in 1893, a second tragedy happened at Ford's Theater. And I think that, those of the neighborhood who believed the building might be cursed, this only proved their argument. So they were excavating around in the basement. They were doing some work to install electricity, and they were not being very careful, and they dislodged a support column without doing anything to prop up the structure that it was supporting, and a huge 40-foot square chunk of the building collapsed. So here are two different angles of the collapse of Ford's Theater. This happened during the workday. 23 people were killed in this accident. 60 more were injured. And so this huge section of all three stories of the building collapsed. In the fallout scandal of this tragedy, the second tragedy at Ford's Theater, the government gutted the building again, patched it up, turned it back into more of a warehouse processing space. But here again, we have Ford's Theater, the place where Lincoln was shot, cursed perhaps. A second tragedy happens there. And so what is this building going to be used for? And meanwhile, people are coming to Ford's Theater. They're coming to 10th Street. They know what happened here, and they're looking for a place to learn a little bit more about President Lincoln. So what has been happening to the Peterson house this whole while, right? The Peterson house is the place where President Lincoln died. It's directly across the street. And so from 1893, so that's the year of the collapse, to 1930, the Lincoln Museum was inside the Peterson house. And this fellow standing on the steps was a man named Osborne Oldroyd. And Osborne Oldroyd was a Lincoln fanatic. He was somebody who collected all things, anythings Lincoln, and he filled the Peterson house with 3,000 objects, paintings, photographs, bits of wallpaper, a chair that maybe Lincoln had sat in. Yes. Robin asks, is it true that General Grant was originally supposed to be a guest of the president on the night of the tragedy of the assassination? Yes, originally the Grants were the Lincoln's first choice for guests, but they declined the invitation. Apparently Mrs. Grant and Mrs. Lincoln didn't actually like each other very much. So they declined the invitation and the Grants went out of town. The assassination happened Easter weekend, and so they were going to spend Easter with the Grants were going to spend Easter with their children. And so there was some thought about, did John Wilkes Booth have designs on perhaps also trying to assassinate General Grant if he was sitting there next to Lincoln? We don't know. There's too many what ifs and unanswered loose ends in that hypothesis. But yeah, General Grant was supposed to be a guest that night. He wasn't. And so things played out the way that they did. Okay, so people are coming to the Peterson house to learn about Lincoln, to remember Lincoln, to look at stuff belonging to and related to Lincoln. And meanwhile, Ford's Theater across the street is starting to get some more attention as the place where President Lincoln died, or was assassinated rather. So this photograph is from the 1920s. This man here was a congressman. His name was Henry Riggs Rathbone. So thinking of the Lincoln's guests, who they ended up with, and not General Grant, Major Henry Rathbone was this man's father. So Major Rathbone was sort of he was absolutely traumatized from being in the box that evening. He was wounded by John Wilkes Booth. He blamed himself for the rest of his life for not stopping John Wilkes Booth from assassinating the president or from getting away, right? And so it's sort of interesting to think that his son, Henry Riggs Rathbone, would decide that Ford's Theater was a place that needed to be marked to commemorate the tragedy that had occurred there. And so it was through his initiative that the first plaque was put on the building that is Ford's Theater. And so this happened in the 1920s. In the 1930s, the National Park Service got the building and they moved Osborne Oldroyd's collection of Lincoln stuff, the Lincoln Museum, into the first floor of Ford's Theater, but it wasn't a theater yet. It was just an open museum. And so it wasn't until the 1960s, so we're nearing 100 years after the assassination had happened. We're coming up on 100 years since the Civil War. People are looking at Ford's Theater and they're starting to ask more about the assassination itself. And the conversation comes into, let's renovate Ford's Theater. Let's restore it to look as it did on the night of the assassination. Let's turn it back into the theater that it was. And then what are we going to do with it? And so Actors Equity Association got involved in this conversation, and they started advocating for making Ford's Theater a working theater and a performance venue once more. And so there was this tremendous amount of money designated to go toward restoring theater. And that's where we get this fabulous quote. It would be a modern tragedy if 3 million of public funds were expended to reenact his death. So to just be a shrine to the place of the assassination. So if the funds were expended to reenact his death in the theater, while he himself spent so many pleasurable hours of life there. So this argument of honoring Lincoln by making Ford's Theater a place where joy and laughter and sort of a common human experience could be shared in the way that President Lincoln had come to the theater so many times. This is where we get this idea. So the Secretary of the Interior, head of the National Park Service, is seriously considering the plans to change the restoration into something that would allow Ford's Theater to be a functioning theater once more. And then Frankie Hewitt, who is the founder of Ford's Theater Society, got involved. And she also made the argument that the federal government was probably not in the best position to produce plays. And so she founded Ford's Theater Society, which is who I work for, to actually produce the theater on stage. So that's when our partnership with the National Park Service began in the 1960s. So if we had restored the theater just to be the place and had made it only a place where we learned the story of the assassination, Hewitt makes the argument that it would have been a monument to John Wilkes Booth, to the assassin and the assassination itself. But by making it a theater, we would make it a memorial and a living memorial to President Lincoln. So that is approved, and the renovations and reconstruction of the theater commence. I love these interior construction photos from the 1960s of the inside of Ford's Theater. Interesting to see though, so we've got these exterior bricks. So for the number of times that they've gutted the inside of the building and they've punched out extra windows and they've filled in windows again, that sort of skeleton of Ford's Theater has managed to survive and stood witness to all of this history. So here's how it would look for us today.
Got you a couple questions if you want them.
I know. All right, let's see. Did Robert Lincoln feel the same way that the building should be preserved? I don't know. I don't think we have a whole lot of words on that, because we know he was at the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial.
Well, they wouldn't have been talking about the theater coming back, would they,
Not at
in the
that point.
1920s?
I mean, in the 20s, that's when the plaque was getting put on Ford's Theater. That's when Rathbone was
Right.
getting that plaque on there. But so, yeah, so the conversation of turning it into a theater
Would have been.
wasn't
He
part of the
died just a few years after the dedication in 22. So
Susan has a memory of watching the reopening of Ford's Theater in 4th grade. Ah, that's awesome.
she also asked about Rathbone's tragic ending, and I refrained from getting into it and thought I would save that for you.
So Major Rathbone did have a very tragic ending. So he, never forgave himself. He always blamed himself for the rest of his life for, not stopping the assassination. And who knows if that was the thing that sort of drove him mad, or if there were more factors, quite possibly, right, if he'd been a soldier in the army during the Civil War. But he and Clara Harris got married, they had children, and they were in Germany, because Rathbone was an ambassador over there, or some kind of delegate. And he went insane, and he killed Clara, and he tried to kill the children. So Clara was able to sort of lock the kids away safely. She hid them in a locked room, but he did kill her one night and then tried to kill himself. And so he spent the rest of his days in a hospital for the mentally insane. So really horrible, horrible end of that story, which is, kind of makes it all the more complex and interesting to think about how his son, Henry Riggs Rathbone, would want to come back to Ford's Theater and mark this place. Again, the power of place was persistent, right? People never forgot what happened in this spot, but it didn't have a marking. It didn't have a sign. And so just kind of interesting that he was the one, tremendously sad. this tragedy just sort of spirals out and continues to affect the lives of everybody who was there. So I mentioned that Matthew Brady's studio took crime scene photographs of the theater. And so they actually were able to use those when they restored the theater to make it look as it does today. So here's one of the crime scene photographs of the presidential box. And you can see how we've recreated the space today. So it looks almost exactly the same. And then if you were to be an actor standing on stage, looking out at the audience, this is what you would see. And so Susan, who remembers the reopening of Ford's Theater in the 1960s, these chairs are not the same. So there was an effort in the 1960s to restore the theater to be as historically accurate as possible, all the way down to the chairs. And the problem is, people in 1865 sat in wooden chairs, just loose in the theater. They didn't have to have aisles or anything. And modern audiences were not comfortable. And so in order to make the theater a comfortable place where people would actually want to go and sit through a show, we did a big restoration renovation in 2009 in honor of Lincoln's 200th birthday. And we got better seats. So they're not historically accurate. They're historically flavored. They look good, but they're more comfortable for modern audiences. Susan remembers the chairs, not comfortable. But I actually think that that's sort of an extraordinary opportunity that we have here at Ford's Theater. Because the space isn't original, we aren't that kind of sacred shrine to this tragic moment. We are able to be this place. We have the opportunity to be this place of life and creative art. We are able to be this living memorial to President Lincoln, where you and your students can actually come and sit in those seats and see a play on stage and learn the story of the tragedy that happened there, but we're not bound to it in the same way that we would be if they were the original seats from 1865. So if you were to come see a play at Ford's Theater, while we're not necessarily bound to the original space, we certainly respect it. And we certainly respect what happened in this place because there's no escaping it. So whenever we talk with set designers, we tell them the theater is a character in the show. The theater will win. You never escape the fact that we're in Ford's Theater. So no matter what play is on stage, we never cover up President Lincoln's box. So this was a show called Sabrina Fair. It's a romantic comedy. Notice over on our right, we have President Lincoln's box decorated with the flags, just so it's not covered up in any way. And then we do plays that celebrate and explore the American experience. So sometimes we do sort of classic American shows from the canon. Sometimes we do history plays that dig into Civil War history and Lincoln's life and leadership and legacy. So this is an actor portraying President Lincoln on our stage. Sometimes we do musicals that have absolutely nothing to do with President Lincoln whatsoever. This was a musical comedy we did just several years ago. We gave a nod to our neighbor, the Lincoln Waffle Shop, which is across the street. So, again, Lincoln is sort of always with us, always around us, but he didn't come to see plays about himself. So as we are honoring him in this way, I don't know that we always have to watch plays about him either. And then often we do plays that sort of continue to explore the many legacies that Lincoln and the Civil War have left for us to learn from and grapple with. So this particular play was called Fly, and it was about the Tuskegee Airmen and the African-American pilots in World War II. And so here again, note how we have transformed the space to be the sky and an airfield. These were projection screens, and there were moments in this show where it really felt like we were flying with these guys through the air. But even in this picture, and it's quite dark and dramatic lighting, but you can just make out President Lincoln's flags on his box. So no matter what play is on stage, it can be modern, it can be historical, it can be traditional, it can be avant-garde. We never cover up President Lincoln's box. So there's always that blend of the old and the new when you come visit us at Ford's Theater. And across the street, we have incorporated into our campus the Peterson boarding house, which has been restored to look as a boarding house would have in the 1860s. And so visitors, not today because we're still semi-closed due to COVID, but in the before times, in the hopefully future times, visitors can walk through the Peterson house and see the place where President Lincoln died, sort of just as all of those people who were disrupting Willie Clark's life in 1865 were coming through the house to see this place. And then next door to the Peterson house, we have our Center for Education and Leadership, where our offices are and where we have additional exhibits that continue to explore Lincoln's life and legacy. So that's how we got from then to now. That's how Ford's is this place to remember Lincoln, to honor Lincoln, to learn about Lincoln. And it's sort of this vibrant and historical anchor here in downtown Washington. One last picture I love sharing. So this was from the 150th anniversary of the assassination. And we had about 2,000 people join us on 10th Street for a candlelight vigil to commemorate the moment the assassination happened. And then they stood out there on 10th Street with us for several hours, just as people had in 1865, waiting to hear of news of the president as he lay dying and as he finally passed away the next morning. So extraordinary moment to think about how much this place matters in our history, how much this moment matters to us even today. Susan asks, can I show the staircase, the curved staircase that President Lincoln, in the theater? I don't think I have a picture of that in my slideshow. I'm sorry. But yeah, well, that takes me sort of to the end. It's of course an ongoing journey, right? As we continue to study this history. Oh, the staircase with the books. I don't have a picture of that in my slideshow either. Let's see. I can try to find one though. While I look for a picture of the staircase and the book column, the book tower, I'll take any other questions.
Alex and I did a program once. We used to talk about Lincoln's legacy. I guess we still do. But the idea that, the Lincoln Memorial became the stage in the 1920s because, Ford's Theater wasn't ready to be the stage again. And so the Lincoln became the stage. And I just thought this was a fitting way to incorporate this into the Lincoln Memorial story, because after 1963, when it really does become this huge stage on the Lincoln Memorial, that gets us right back around to almost 100 years after the assassination. And then we start, there's this desire to have this theater back and this stage again. And so it seemed like a nice kind of full circle way to think about Lincoln and memorialization. And so best books on Lincoln or the assassination. Alex?
All right, well, I just sent you a link to a blog about our book tower. So hopefully that also includes a really cool time-lapse video of them building it. So that's better than any picture I could show you.
I've never seen it.
So I don't know, best book. So a really engaging book is Manhunt by James Swanson. There's a young adult version of by the same author called Chasing Lincoln's Killer. And that's a great way to really dig into those 12 days that John Wilkes Booth was on the run and learn a lot of the details that way. As I recommended They Knew Lincoln earlier in my presentation, I highly recommend They Knew Lincoln by John E. Washington. It is such an extraordinary insight into this very human experience and this human lens of this man, this leader, life in Washington. Yes. So Susan asks, Ford's reopened just about the time Dr. King was assassinated and the riots happened. Yeah. So Ford's reopened in 1968. So there was a lot happening in Washington, D.C. at that time and the nation.
Carol asked about your insights on Dr. Mudd.
I got asked about that this morning by a fifth grader. So Dr. Mudd claimed that this guy showed up in the middle of the night with a broken leg. And he said that this person did not identify himself as John Wilkes Booth, and that this person had told him this story of falling from his horse and his horse crushing its leg. And that's how he had the broken leg. The part where Dr. Mudd's story sort of doesn't hold up. There were neighbors and formerly enslaved people who testified that Dr. Mudd had met John Wilkes Booth, and so he would have recognized him because they actually knew each other. And then the other part is that Dr. Mudd sat on this knowledge for a few days. So, John Wilkes Booth came to Dr. Mudd within that first 24 hours, and Dr. Mudd didn't come to the Union soldiers to say, hey, some suspicious fellow stopped by my house with a broken leg on the night that Lincoln was assassinated. He didn't come forward with that information for like 3 days. So sort of at best, he was just trying to help John Wilkes Booth get a little further along on his escape by withholding the information. So Dr. Mudd was found guilty of the conspiracy, sentenced to life in prison, and then he was later pardoned for stepping up and helping save a whole bunch of his fellow prisoners' lives during a yellow fever outbreak. But he served about 4 or 6 years in prison. His house is also a museum. Is there any truth to the Lincoln Kennedy's conspiracy? No, I don't think so. I think that's one of those wonderful opportunities to notice coincidences and links in hindsight. Oh, Susan, I don't remember who pardoned Mudd. Do you remember who pardoned Mudd? I don't think it was Johnson. I think it was after that. You stumped me. Jody, thank you for joining us today. I'm glad you're finding all of these insights into history engaging.
Jody's first grader stumped me last year.
Oh, really?
Yeah. They had more questions that I couldn't answer, so. Thank you. We'll look into the who pardoned Mudd, right? See if we can find it. Bethany, you don't know, do you? While we're thinking on this, and if you have any last minute questions, Bethany, do you know?
I think it was Johnson.
Oh, really? Like
I think Andrew Johnson. Yeah, I think it was him.
Makes sense.
Okay, there you go. Add it to the list of pardons that he did.
There you go. Exactly. Yep.
So before we jump off and say thank you, I wanted to just tease next month. I know it's hard to imagine like next month as next year and all, but we have another hopefully great session for you to continue to join us for. I've got another special guest, the education specialist from the Gettysburg National Military Park, Barb Sanders, is going to join us. She called her program Decoding Gettysburg, and she wants to analyze the Gettysburg Address because it is one of the speeches that's inscribed on the wall at the Lincoln Memorial. She says we're going to look at it line by line and then work to decode the elements of monumentation. I think she's going to focus a little bit more on the monuments in the battlefield, from text to symbolism, materials, and location. So thinking about how we've done all of that with the Lincoln Memorial, and we, Alex and I have done some things where we've compared, the Emancipation statue in Lincoln Park. And so we're going to take a look at Gettysburg and see some of the connections to to Lincoln. Bethany and I think we're just talking about how it's the only place you find a memorial to a speech. So there's a memorial to the Gettysburg Address inside the Soldiers National Cemetery. The date, oh, this is great. Barb specifically chose the third Wednesday in January because it happens to be Robert E. Lee's birthday. And that's why she picked that date for her session. So I appreciate you all joining us tonight. I know it's getting close to the holidays. You're probably all pretty tired, and I hope you all enjoy your breaks. Thank you, Alex, for joining us tonight. Thank you, Edward and Aaron, for hosting us, and really appreciate everybody participating with us. And if there's anything we can do to bring some of these ideas to your students. And if you were with us last time, I threw out the idea that we are looking for suggestions and ideas about what we can do to commemorate the Lincoln Memorial's 100th anniversary in May. And if you all have ideas and ways you might want to participate with us, we're really looking to do that. So these sessions are to get the juices flowing and think about ways we can do that. I don't know if I've shared this last time, but when I go out, I ask students all the time, what kind of things can we do? And one group suggested that we needed a piñata that would have little Lincoln things fall out of it. And I don't know if you've ever noticed at the Lincoln Memorial, I had high school students this week who thought we should, there are these two urns on either end as you get ready to walk up the steps. And high school students thought maybe we should light those up. And I'm pretty sure that our cultural resource people would not approve of fire as we're trying to commemorate 100 years of this building, probably not wanting fire, but hopefully you all will come up with some great ideas with your students and join us again next month. So thank you all for your time this evening. Thanks to all of you who participated with us, and happy holidays, everybody, and we'll see you next year. Thank you.